I didn't plan for an episode like this in the Way of Canaan this early on. Um, I was just launching the Substack and kind of getting things going. I had planned to launch right around this time. And then in the middle of all that, we had the news that Charlie Kirk had been shot and killed. And now just a week ago, it was his funeral memorial service, public memorial service. And by the time this is out, probably be 2 weeks ago compared to when I'm recording it now. Um, and I think we have to first and foremost um, recognize that somebody who was a husband, a father, a son, a friend to many, was murdered. And that is a sad thing that we need to mourn. That there is such public forms of killings that are happening in our country, um, almost nowadays on a regular basis. At least once or twice a week, we'll see high profile shootings. And, we need to mourn that. We need to mourn the loss of life. And there's no place for celebration. I think that was what I noticed when I first saw the news, and then my Facebook feed just started to blow up with reactions from friends on the left and the right. I would say most of my friends on the right or on the left were not in the celebratory mode, but I did see a lot of comments on news stories of people celebrating, and that had no place in happening, and that was wrong. At the same time, though, I think why we need to have a conversation like this is that the the cultural phenomena of the last decade and the influence that Charlie Kirk has had, and that much of that was cloaked and then co-opted in the language of Christianity. And really, it's part of a larger movement that has been co-opting the language of following Jesus for decades. And I would have probably even say centuries, at different times throughout our history, is a reality that we need to talk about in an environment like this, and just journey about how does this really fit into the way of following Jesus, or following the way of Jesus in a way that is authentic and um, in touch with the original um, words and teachings and the lifestyle of Jesus. So I invite you to join with me on this journey. Welcome to the Way of Canaan. This is my story of searching for what truly matters when traditional spiritual institutions seem to be falling apart. Together, we'll talk about important faith topics, look at how they connect to history in today's world, and share hope for a better future. I'm Leon Longard, but feel free to call me Canaan. Okay, so as we start this episode, questions got to be asked. Why would a topic like this fit into a podcast series like The Way of Canaan? After all, isn't this about discovering what is essential in faith, and what is this? What is the death of Charlie Kirk have to do with faith and spirituality? After all, I think that's something to really be addressed, and I want to just kind of touch on that first, because I've had that happen over time. Social media, you make comments about stories and things that are going on in the world. And I occasionally have had pushback from friends who are like, well, that's getting out of your territory. You're supposed to be about the gospel and talking about Jesus, not talking about politics. And I struggle with that, because it's this narrow definition of the gospel that is basically, get people to agree with a few propositional statements, and then that gets them into the church, gets them going to heaven, and then just keep them coming along to the building so that they can keep on the right path to get to heaven. But when you really look at the gospel, there's a fuller understanding of the gospel that even Jesus presented when he was on earth. There's there's a scene early on in his life where he's speaking at the synagogue in his hometown, and it's common in that day for men of a certain age to be given the opportunity to read from the scripture for when they gather in the synagogue. And so he was visiting, he came to Nazareth. I'm going to read the passage here. His boyhood home, he went as usual to the synagogue on the Sabbath, following the Jewish customs and his culture of the time, and stood to read the scripture. The scroll of the Isaiah the prophet was handed to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where this was written: The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. And then he rolled up the scroll and he handed it back. And then he went on to say something which probably irritated the crowd a little bit more. Well, he went on to say, This scripture you've just heard has been fulfilled this very day. So he identified his mission around this scripture, which is good news to the poor and to the oppressed, that they would be set free. So it talks about justice type things. And then he adds in this piece about, he kind of, they're like, how can this be? Isn't this just Joseph's son? And he responds back, you will undoubtedly quote this proverb, Physician, heal yourself, meaning do the miracles, here in your hometown that you did in Capernaum. But I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. And then he goes on to tell these two stories from Israel's history. Certainly, there were many needy widows in Israel and in Elijah's time when the heavens were closed for 3.5 years. So there was this famine going on. And he points out that there were so many Jewish widows that probably could have used, um, had Elijah come and do a miracle for them and provide for food. But he went to this Gentile woman, this foreigner, and provided food for that foreign woman. And then there was also, the story of, he reminds of the story of a Syrian general who was healed of leprosy by Elisha, one of the other prophets of the Old Testament, while the Israelites, well, there were probably many other people having leprosy in Israel. And so he kind of makes this point that the people that you want on the outside, God actually works among those people. And there's just a whole theme of justice that comes out. And I think we can't ignore the justice component of the gospel. That God is about righting tables and about leveling the scales and about lifting up the oppressed um, and actually also sometimes bringing down the proud. So, but at the same time, there is this movement that's emerged, as I said, for centuries, that has kind of co-opted religious language into a political agenda. And there are times when we need to talk about that, how that the misuse of religious language has been used for political agendas. And it's a lot of this God is on our side type of attitude. And it equates others who are of a different view as being the dark forces that are destroying the country and standing against God's will for the nation, and sometimes comparing them to the Antichrist. And in reality, it's a Eurocentric view of Christianity that really goes back to the age of Constantine. And it was brought to the New World with this theology that was more based in the idea of the empire than it was based in the reality of Jesus and the story of Jesus. And that has persisted in our culture for, well, as long as the United States has existed, even before, as long as there have been European settlers here. But even if you go back, that has carried back. As I said, it goes back to the time of Constantine. That's 1600 years or more. There has been this civil religion based more the in the history of the Roman Empire and the supremacy of European culture over other cultures. And it has tied religious language into it for a long time. And see, here's the thing. I have friends who fit the descriptions of the people that the religious right would like to portray as the enemy. They're the ones destroying America. They're godless or whatever language they want to use. And as I've gotten to know many of these people, I see people who have deep and genuine faith, love Jesus well, and they need to know that they're heard. And so it's worth talking about the needs of those people and the perspective of those people as we talk about the events that are happening and the response to Charlie Kirk's death. And I think sometimes they need to know that not every let's look, white, cisgendered Christian male thinks of them in this us versus them paradigm that is so prevalent in Christian circles and in religious circles. I've noticed this. I'll probably put links in the show notes for a few different articles I've read, actually a couple different videos that a friend of mine has done. She calls them her dad hug, where she tries to talk with conservatives about some of the ways that they responded to the death of Charlie Kirk and the memorial service and what that message communicates to people who are not in their subculture. And then there's also a great article, a Substack post by a theologian of Indian descent, as in from India, Indian descent, about the effect of much of Charlie Kirk's words on Black and Brown people. So those are things I'm going to share as resources. Um, I think the other thing to remember is that what's being called Christian nationalism, and I think that would be an appropriate title for it, that it creates this public representation of the character of God when people say that God is on their side and not on other people's sides. And I often say, when I look at things that are coming out of certain circles, I think, God could almost file a defamation of character lawsuit against some who claim to represent him, but represent a very bad image of who God really is, particularly if they're looking at something outside of the way of Jesus and the picture of God that is presented to us through Jesus and his character. And it's also important with this to recover the true meaning of words that have been co-opted by political agendas. So that's where last episode I talked about the what does it mean to be an authentic Christian? Some words are just have been co-opted, and we can't just abandon them. We need to help redefine them for people who are not understanding of where they really come from. So, as we're progressing in this episode, I am going to focus more on kind of the responses that have happened since the death of Charlie Kirk. I don't really want to spend as much time on his teaching and his beliefs or try to refute all of his stuff. I mean, there's too much of a record and there's a lot of resources out there that you can get into. As I said, I'll probably reference a few of them. And I think want to get into some of the cultural realities and trends that have fed this phenomenon. Some of this honestly could spin off later on into other episodes that are just focused on some parts of this phenomena. And like I said, maybe share some resources. I want to mention a couple here. I may quote them in the episode, or if not, I would check out, put it closer to me so it can be seen. The Myth of a Christian Nation by Greg Boyd actually was written in 2004, so way before Trump or the current administration was even thinking that there was no idea that this current administration would be. So it's not all about the current administration. It goes back to the George W. Bush years, too. And then another one, Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles and Sun Chan Ra, um, gets into, from a Native American and indigenous perspective, a lot of the heresies that have come out of this Eurocentric view of the gospel, particularly the doctrine of discovery and um, and the manifest destiny heresy, and talks about how those have permeated throughout the history of the United States and existed. And I'll probably get into some of the fallout around motives. I think there's been a lot of conversation about the motive of the shooter, um, and we don't know a lot yet. People are painting pictures, and I think we have to give that time. But I think there are some things I think we can see about that, and really some of the attempts. I think one of the things I've seen come out of this is this effort to revise some of Charlie Kirk's quotes. People will throw out quotes of things he said about people and try to portray them in the negative, and then others will say, "Whoa, you got to see it in context." And a couple of those might be worth talking about just to kind of give a perspective on them and kind of see the bigger picture of, well, maybe you do see the context, but it may not change um, the view of what he was actually saying in those moments. So that's kind of where we're going to go with this as we move along. Okay, so one thing that kind of stood out to me as I was noticing people responding to Charlie Kirk's death, a number of friends who are more on the conservative side posted things like, I can't believe we've gotten to this point, or something like that. And I find myself wondering, where have these people been living for the last decade or longer, even? Because the reality is, we've been at this point of political violence in our country for quite a while. We've hit a lot of low points, and we've been there for a while. You look at the number of school shootings that have happened and the various reasons and the backgrounds of the people that have been engaged in those. I think, some specific examples. I think of 2013, the time when Dylan Roof went into a Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina, and he, as he's sitting and listening to a Bible study and then praying with people, then all of a sudden stands up and starts shooting them. One of them being um, a leader in the African American community, or a couple of those people being leaders in the African American community there in their town. And then you have, just actually this summer I was out, happened to be in Charlottesville, Virginia for a day on my way on a trip that I was doing, and I took a walk down on the Old Town Mall area, which is a walking mall. And as you cross, there's only a few driving streets, and one of them is named Heather Higher Way now. And you may remember back in 2017, there was the Unite the Right um, rally that was happening in Charlottesville as they were tearing down statues of Confederate soldiers in the city. And there was this effort to change that attitude. And there was a counter protest of people that were protesting against the Unite the Right rally, which tended to be a lot of neo Nazi, alt right, white supremacist groups. And during one of those counter protests, this young man drives right into the crowd and kills Heather Heyer. And that's why that section has been named now Heather Heyer Way. And I live now in Minnesota. And back in June, we woke up one morning on a Saturday morning watching the news, and there's kind of this tension in the morning news about these shootings that have happened in Brooklyn Park and Champlin and these suburbs, northwest suburbs of Minneapolis. And about a half hour, an hour into the news, it finally they get the confirmation to say it's okay to say that someone had gone after multiple Democratic um, uh, representatives in our state government, killing Melissa Hortman and her husband, and injuring Senator John Hoffman and his wife. Oh, and also Melissa Hortman's dog. Um, and so we'd seen this low point for a long time. And this was another experience of that, where we turned to violence to address our political differences. But I think because it was somebody on the right this time, there was this feeling of, oh, it's one of ours. That, oh, no, 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 we're not, we don't do this. Or we are, you know, this is just, and it became this blame thing about it's all left-wing violence. When the reality is there's a long history of right-wing violence against minorities, against people who are opposed to racism, and against politicians who hold different positions than theirs. And so we really have to say this is not, somehow that we've reached some new low point. This is a continuation of this culture of violence. But I think it's unique, and we see how it's moving into this rush to blame, and we're seeing in a number of other events. There's this quick, immediate, let's blame it on the left type thing that's happening. And it's this fear thing that certain politicians are really good at manipulating and are work hard to manipulate. And it's not an old thing. It goes back a long time. In fact, if we want to be honest, it goes back 2,000 years, and then a point 300 years to 400 years later in the fourth century, when things changed, it it kind of changed the circumstances for the relationship between the church and the empire or the government. And that is what people are fearing losing. I was thinking about this as I think about this and talk about this. There, there's this always this narrative of persecution that exists among particularly white evangelical people. And persecution is real. There are real instances throughout history of persecution. There's real instances of even in our day cultures where people are being persecuted for their faith. I have a friend from another country where Christianity is in the minority, and he talks about how people within their other religions or the majority religion would actually blow up churches. And so this is not something that doesn't happen. It is a reality. But in the United States, we've kind of turned it into this narrative that anything happens, particularly against white evangelical people, or even the slightest inconvenience, and it turns into this persecution narrative. So this has existed in our culture and in our history for a long time. And I think of it, the historical roots, and I want to go back to this book I mentioned, Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles and Song Chan Ra, which they talk about the history of the really it's about dismantling the doctrine of discovery and some other heresies that came from Europe in the settling of the New World, and affected how that affected particularly the indigenous people. But in that, they do a great historical analysis of the period of the fourth century of the Christian church when there had just been another persecution, and the um, people, and after this persecution, Constantine was in a civil war with another prospective emperor. And there's this moment where he wins this battle. It historically is known as the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and he consolidates the power of the empire into his hands. And there's this story that emerges of him seeing a cross in the sky and having a voice that, or and seeing the words, by this conquer. And so then he used that symbol to conquer his enemies. He incorporated that symbol into his legend of conquering the enemies. And he supposedly converts to Christianity. We can question whether or not that's true. And officially Christianity becomes the state religion of the empire. Eusebius, a historian of the day, a Christian historian, whose hometown had experienced much persecution during the great persecutions that had led up to this time, becomes almost like the promoter of Constantine as God's chosen leader to turn the empire into a Christian empire. And you see this merging of faith and the empire that happens. And no longer is Christianity this oppressed minority, but it becomes the religion of power. And people buy into it. And you really can't blame them because they've been living under 300 years of a history of persecution. So the idea that the persecution has been lifted is a thing to celebrate. But eventually, they begin to inherit an idea of Christianity that is entirely different than what Jesus had brought to earth. And in fact, it's kind of interesting. I kind of always think about this and I go, you know, by this conquer, I kind of think Constantine missed the point. It wasn't go and conquer your enemies in a military battle, but that the way of Jesus conquers the militaristic way of the empire. But instead, the followers of Jesus became merged into the empire. And this has gone on for years. And you see this constant, particularly, I think, in the last, oh, half century to a century in the United States, we've seen this fascination with the end times, the great persecution, the great tribulation. We just had another time where people are talking about the rapture coming. And it's this constant narrative of fearing losing power and losing influence and the possible persecution that could come again from that. And particularly for white Christians, for European descent Christians in the United States, it's that fear that somehow another ethnic group would rise up into power and put us into a lower place, and then we would experience persecution again. We actually had that happen where we live. We live just outside of the Minneapolis St. Paul metropolitan area. We've had a large um, settlement of Somali refugees in our community. And the community back in 2018 or so, there was a group that started to pull together called Concerned Community Citizens, or CQ. And they began to have discussions about they would gather at a local fast food restaurant and they would talk about, and it was three things that went in sequence. It was a concern about persecution, and they did a display about persecution. And then it became about how all these refugees were starting to create a problem for the local economy, and that could we handle all these refugees? And then it moved into let's do a referendum to put a moratorium on refugee resettlement in the city. Now, eventually, that movement lost. It took over parts of the city council for a season, but those city council members have been removed, and there has been a big pushback against that. But it was very much tied into this idea that if we let too many of these other people come to our community, we will be back in a state of persecution again. And then the irony is, we become the persecutors as we seek to prevent and defend ourselves against persecution. So you see this progression of things happening, and you see it coming to this place where we had this murder of Charlie Kirk, and this is the point where then these people who fear persecution see one of their own being killed, and it becomes this story of let's blame the other for this when we're still trying to figure out where these people or what exactly are the motives for the individual who shot Charlie Kirk. And we've seen the progression of other incidents that have happened since then, where it's constantly this idea of building this image of this anti anti law and order, anti Republican, anti white horde that's coming to destroy America. And this is what the administration is taking advantage of. And as we try to recover what's essential in faith, we have to beware of what the false narratives are and realize that there are terms that are real and true. There are concepts that are true, such as there are people who are persecuted for their faith. But we can't allow that to be exploited to the point that we become the persecutors of others. Okay, so in this last section, I want to get into a couple of the quotes that have been going around, kind of the revisioning of quotes. People, as people brought up quotes that of things that Charlie Kirk said, um, people would respond back with, "Well, yeah, you have to hear it in the context before you judge it," and um, that's kind of interesting because, and then I saw a couple. I'm just going to focus on a couple here that people had posted and tried to provide context to. One of them, I'm kind of trying to figure through where I had originally seen it because I felt like it was a little different, but even here it's the same thing. The one is, there was the one about how he doesn't like the word empathy. He called it a dangerous new age word made up in the 20th century, I think, in some context. Um, and in the context, he said, so people are like, oh, yeah, he's against empathy. And then the people responded with, well, you have to see the context. And so, but the context is basically all he says is different is he says sympathy is a better word. It's a healthier word. In one of the quotes I saw, one of the videos I saw, he made this point of like, empathy is where you're trying to feel the pain of others, and that's impossible. You can't do that. Sympathy is a better word. And he, even in like one video I saw from his podcast, he kind of draws that in, kind of making a reference to back in the 90s when Bill Clinton would say, in his campaigns, he would say, I feel your pain, as he was talking about the economic feelings that people had or the experiences and the pain they were experiencing. So you get into this, and it's kind of this nuanced thing of, okay, so what's he getting at? So um, sympathy is okay, but empathy is just unhealthy, made up word. And I had to go back and I had to look at it a bit. Went back into, um, actually found, and I'll share a clip, I'll share a link to this article on the Merriam-Webster dictionary page, um, or Merriam-Webster dictionary page. Anyway, um, and they get into like this cool article with explaining empathy and sympathy. You know, because really now these days, sympathy just kind of has this feeling of pity, like, oh man, tough to be you. And you know, I think of that when somebody who is experiencing pain or who's comes from a disadvantaged place sees, here's this man um, from a very wealthy family background who's made millions, built up his own wealth of $12 million or something like that was his estate. And he's saying, you know, sympathy, I have sympathy for you. It's kind of this feeling of pity, and you kind of just feels disingenuous to say sympathy in those situations. And so empathy kind of has that idea of trying to understand the other person's emotions. And obviously, yeah, reality is you can't feel exactly what somebody else feels. The interesting thing, though, is if you go back to the history of the word sympathy, that's exactly what it meant. It was this feeling of the other person's emotions. And empathy, when it started to be used in the 20th century, early on, it was more about, yeah, you were identifying with somebody else's emotions, but you recognized that you could not exactly feel them because you were not them. So really, in the true sense of the word, empathy was what he was aiming for in trying to define sympathy, or at least what he claimed he was aiming for. Although I kind of wonder if that's actually the case with him. Um, and you know, actually, there's this quote from 1958 I want to find in the article, and it said, "Yeah, here it is from the Journal of the American Medical Association. The act or capacity of entering into or sharing the feelings of another is known as sympathy. This was as recent as 1958. Empathy, on the other hand, not only is an identification of sorts, but also connotates an awareness of one's separateness from the observed. One of the most difficult tasks put upon man is reflective commitment to another's problems while maintaining his own identity." So it was kind of it really was creating a healthy understanding of understanding someone else's pain or someone else's feelings and emotions without tying yourself into them. So Charlie was kind of going off on a wrong direction here, even to make that distinction. And I think it is an unhealthy distinction as well. And really, if you look at it from the perspective of, you know, people who identify him as a Christian martyr or something like that, or an evangelist, Bill Clinton called him, or not Bill Clinton, President Trump called him a evangelist for America, implying, but using language of like almost that he is a, you know, evangelist in the Christian sense of the word. It was this white Christian view of America. But empathy for others and sympathy for others is something that you find throughout the New Testament and throughout Scripture. And so I'll share a link to an article where it has about 30 different verses related to empathy. I think some of them might be pushing it a little bit, but there's a couple of really good ones. And there's the one talks about, in the writer of Hebrews said that we don't have a high priest that can't be touched by our weakness, but in every way was tempted by us. That's referring to Jesus really showing empathy or identifying with our human weakness. That was an empathy that he expressed. And in First Corinthians chapter 12, Paul wrote to the early followers of Jesus that, you know,
about sympathy and he's talking about, he's kind of using the imagery of the body when he talks about a group of people, a group of believers, followers of Jesus together. And he says, if one member suffers, all members suffer with it. And if one member is honored, all members rejoice with it. So there's this sense of we are identifying with each other in our suffering and also in our good things. So that it's really, empathy is a very biblical concept and a very Christian concept when it comes to following Jesus. So it's hard to really separate it from, you know, try to somehow make it a, just this new age term or something like that. So the second one that I wanted to bring up is the one about the Second Amendment, and that sometimes we have to have a few gun deaths throughout the year in order to preserve the Second Amendment. Yeah, the quote that commonly went around was um, he- trying to see where it find the specific spot, but he basically says it will not happen. You could significantly reduce them. You talk about reducing gun deaths. Oh, here's the actual quote. It says, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our God-given rights. And so commonly, this was in response to um, calls for gun control, in order to limit the number of fatalities happening through these mass shootings and things like that. And the broader context of this, and people go, well, this is what he was just, when you read it, his comparison was automobile deaths. And he says, every year we have 50,000 auto deaths a year. 50,000 is the number he threw out. And so he tried to make the comparison that the um, the number of auto deaths doesn't, we consider it still worthwhile to have automobiles in our country for what they provide for us. And that to me doesn't really help solve or make the case really well, because it ignores that there are so many things we have done through the years in order to reduce auto deaths and to try to make automobiles safer. So we have done things through legislation to try to limit the number of auto deaths, going back to even, seat belts, whether or not we had them in cars. There was a big push to we need seat belts in cars because people were dying in accidents. And that reduced the number of deaths. Then when I was growing up, you didn't even have to wear a seatbelt. I think, we're now so used to it these days that we may forget or may not be aware that when I was a child, it was not really required, even though they were in the cars. I remember going around in cars, standing on the back seat when I was a kid. Um, but there was a point where we realized we really, we've put them in the cars. We got to really encourage people to actually use them. And so we made it a law that people need to wear seatbelts, particularly children. And then, speed limits are all designed around what's the acceptable risk level or what's the safe speed where we can reduce the highest number of deaths. So we have made regulations around automobiles to reduce the number of deaths. And to try to carry that conversation over into the Second Amendment rights, and we're just going to have to deal with the number of deaths because we want to have the Second Amendment rights, um, really implies that somehow this is like an all or nothing deal. And when you talk to most people who um, who are talking about any type of regulation around gun control, it's more about reducing the impact. There's very few people that support gun control that are out there saying we want to get rid of all guns. More and more, it's just about specific guns or types of guns that have a higher capacity to kill more people in a short amount of time, that we can reduce mass murders, which we're seeing so often these days. if we can somehow put some reasonable restrictions on certain types of guns that are really made to shoot multiple times in a short amount of time. And so I think that that is that's a difference. And I think those are the things where I look at the things, and there's plenty of quotes that, things Charlie Kirk had said that really do not represent the way of Christ, the way of Jesus. But I think even in those two, I see just how even trying to put them in context really doesn't match up. And the other thing I wanted to touch on just briefly as I try to wrap up this particular podcast was kind of all the efforts to attach ideology to the motives of the shooter. There's nothing's been said about, by the shooter himself about his motives. Nobody's come out with any clear statements. But immediately there was this quick, oh, it's this radical left ideology that leads to somebody like Charlie Kirk being murdered. And we look at this complicated history of this young man who killed him. And it's interesting because you have one group that's like, well, he came from a extreme MAGA family, and talking about his right wing upbringing, which he was grew up in a Mormon home. He grew up in a very conservative home. And then you also see the part about, and this was there where they started to bring, the LGBTQ community in particular into this left-leaning ideology because he had had a relationship in the last year with a transgender male transitioning to male or female. And so there was kind of this, oh, it's this LGBTQ agenda it's this war on Christianity by the LGBTQ community. And I think that really kind of misses the point. And I've kind of, as I've thought about it, I mean, I do see something, and it really does get into our whole conversations about finding essential faith and some of the deconstruction that happens and things like that. And that whole process of deconstruction that people go through, and something I've observed in that. And so from what I understand of the timeline of um, Tyler Robinson's progression in his views, his political views, and his moral views and his cultural views. He was raised in this very conservative, probably far right wing family as you kind of look at the influences in their life. And he was trained in using guns. I mean, guns were a part of his life. He, in the last year, appeared to be moving much further to the left. So he was entering into a world where being, his view of the world was changing quite dramatically. And people are like, well, how did he get, radicalized by the left? And I don't know that there was this deliberate effort to quote unquote radicalize him. But it's common when someone who's raised, I've seen this in so many lives, in so many people I know, where they were raised in a very conservative, fundamentalist, if you want to say evangelical fundamentalist, probably more fundamentalist, right wing philosophy, that when they begin to move away from that, those early years, remember, this has only been a year for him, can be some of the most radical, like, I gotta go the other way. I gotta be as, anti-right as I was pro-right in the past. So it's kind of like this zeal shifts to the other direction. And so it's not that necessarily that there was this left-wing radical agenda that promoted killing of people like Charlie Kirk, but this individual's response to his shift in ideology was to take it out in a violent means towards Charlie Kirk. And to me, that seems like a more realistic understanding of motive. We'll probably over time find out more about that. Maybe that'll come out in court hearings, since in this case the shooter was not killed. Um, but I think that that is, probably more where we'll end up. And again, this is just my thoughts, not necessarily any evidence on that one. But I think, just some things when I look at all of the responses, and I think what we can see in that is that trying to just pin it on one side or the other probably is not wise. Um, and I think Jesus would look at it and go, there's a tragedy here in the death of a man. And yeah, he, may or may not, as I look at it, he really didn't represent the type of Christianity or the type of Jesus that I follow. And the people who were coming after him and trying to somehow canonize him and make him out to be this martyr are also not following the type of Jesus that I follow. But um, again, it's a human being who died, who was killed brutally, and we have to acknowledge that and we have to mourn that. A favorite rapper of mine, goes by Propaganda as his stage name. He had posted shortly after that, kind of summarizing what he said. It's like, I would never want to live in a world that was guided by the principles that Charlie Kirk advocated, but I also don't want to live in a world where we're subject to a violent death of this man, and where Charlie Kirk was shot and killed in this way. So we can acknowledge the things that are out of touch with a more authentic faith in Jesus, while at the same time mourning the death of this individual. So these are my thoughts right now. And as I said before, probably there's some whole this I'm thinking about where we're going to go next week with this, or next time with this, but um there are some things, many things that could kind of just branch off from this. We'll just kind of see where those things come up in different episodes, but um, keep it, keep seeking and trusting the Holy Spirit to guide you and to guide all of us through all of this. Thank you.
This has been The Way of Canaan. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you want to follow along with other content that I am creating, as particularly posts and notes that I have on my Substack, just check out wayofcanaan.substack.com. Thank you.